Let me start this video by explaining that the Ray Trace Renderer is one of the hardware-accelerated features of After Effects CC. The Ray Trace Renderer performs much better on a computer that has a supported NVIDIA graphics card and CUDA installed. While neither CUDA nor an NVIDIA card are actually required to run the Ray Trace Renderer, having both definitely will speed up your workflow when working with the Ray Trace Renderer. To learn more about this, you can go to the internet and search for supported graphics cards, or better yet, I've already gone through the process of finding this page, so we'll just jump over here into Safari and you can see it's the GPU CUDA OpenGL features page. This page is excellent in the help menu because it's consistently updated, and there are several different links in here explaining how GPU acceleration works inside of After Effects. And if you scroll down, there are some other links that actually explain which graphics cards are supported and which ones aren't, and all kinds of technical things that, if you're into that sort of thing, you can have a blast with. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump back into After Effects. Inside of After Effects here, we have a basic project that has two 3D layers. I have this green pre-comp layer and my Illustrator file. Now, if you look in the upper right corner of this composition, since I have 3D layers enabled, I have this renderer button. Let's click on that, and that'll open my composition settings. You could also press Command or Control K, and then just make sure you're in the Advanced tab. So in here, under the renderer, I want to change it from Classic 3D to Ray Trace 3D. Now when we click OK, you may see a warning window pop up. That's just telling you what features are enabled and disabled when you change the renderer. Now, if we go down to the bottom of the timeline here, I want you to open up Layer 2. And let's not look at the transform options because those are pretty similar to what we've seen before. But if we collapse those, now notice we have geometry options. Now, Illustrator layers, type layers, and shape layers all can have some form of 3D created within the Ray Traced renderer. Illustrator layers give you geometry options that give you the ability to actually bend the layer, not create 3D depth, but actually bend it in space. So let's open up its geometry options. And here I have a curvature option. So I can increase the curvature, and notice as I increase the curvature, it's actually bending a little bit. And to better see this, I'm going to change the view from active camera to this custom view 1. It'll take a second to redraw the scene, but once it redraws, you can see here, now it's actually starting to bend. Here, I'll zoom into 100% so you can better see exactly what's happening. Now notice it's a very jagged bend because it only has 4 segments to the bend. So let's just click and increase the number of segments to that bend. Here, I'll crank it up to something ridiculous, not 189, but let's do something like 50. Okay. So now when I've increased the number of segments, I have a little more smooth bend. If we increase this number a little bit more, notice it's just going to kind of push my logo a little further back. So I may have to open up the transform options and actually move it here a little bit on its Z-axis back in front of my other layer. So I know it's taking a second to refresh, but there we go. You can kind of see this bend. If you want to see it more clearly, we can go up to our toolbar here, click and hold, and grab the Orbit Around tool. Here now I can just click and drag around, and notice as I orbit around, you can see I'm actually bending that logo. So that's all well and good, but what if I actually want to make a 3D version of this logo? Well, thankfully, you can convert Illustrator files into shape layers. So I'm going to start by actually deleting this position keyframe here, just by highlighting it and pressing delete. And I'll go back down to my geometry options, and I'll change the curvature back to 0 and the segments back to 4 because it's not bending. And it'll take a second to redraw, but once it does, you'll see there's my logo over top of my background. Okay, now with Layer 2 selected, go ahead and click on Layer 2. I want you to go up under Layer and choose Create Shapes from Vector Layer. It'll take a second, but it'll turn off the visibility for Layer 3, and it opens up our shape layer, which it looks like nothing's really happened. But if we open up the options for Layer 1, now notice we have geometry options that if we open have extrusion depth. So let's go ahead and just increase the extrusion depth to something like 52. Now, it'll take a second to redraw, but here you can see something started to happen. But you can't really see what's going on with the geometry until you actually add a light into the scene. So let's go up under Layer and choose New Light. Now, I'll go ahead and just create a point light. We can leave the color set up at white and the intensity with 100, and we'll just go ahead and click OK. Now you can see the 3D geometry that's in here. And since I still have my Orbit Around tool here, you can see it definitely has 3D depth. So here, I'll just orbit around just a little bit so we can better see what's going on. Give it a second to redraw. And let's look at some of the other options within this geometry. I'll select Layer 2 here, and I'll scroll down because in addition to the geometry options with the extrusion depth, we also have a bevel style. So see on the edge here, it's just a sharp edge. If I click on the pull down, I could choose something like concave. And once I choose concave, it'll actually give me a nice sharp edge on the edge of my geometry. If I want to see this a little more clearly, I'll just press the period key to zoom in. It'll take a second to redraw, but there you go. You can see it's got some of these edges. Now, if your system doesn't quite look like this, notice mine is adaptive resolution. You can come down here to the lower right corner and click on your previews and see, we could switch it between adaptive resolution and draft and fast draft and things like that. Or we could just switch it to off, which will give you the final render quality. So I'm going to go ahead and switch mine to off. And it'll take a second to redraw when I go back to 100% here. But you'll notice it looks kind of jagged and it really doesn't look quite like metal. Well, the jagged thing will fix all the way at the end. So for right now, let's look at the material options. I'll close my geometry options and open the material options. Down here under my materials, I'll just make my timeline a little larger. And now you should notice I have things like light transmission, which I had before. But if you come down here, now I have a metal option and a reflection intensity. Well, notice there are no reflections. So let's go ahead and crank up the reflection intensity. I'll bring it up to something like 79 or 80%. Now, when you change this, since we turned off the adaptive resolution, it's going to take a little while to render. But once it renders, look at that. We have nice little highlights and reflections in here. And it's now starting to actually look a little bit like metal. Now, of course, I encourage you to continue scrubbing through some of these options and see how things adjust. But there's another way of really making metal pop inside of After Effects, and that's by using an environment map. So here, I'll scroll up and collapse Layer 2. And this green pre-comp is really colorful. And so I want to use this to kind of colorize the whole thing. So I'll select Layer 5, and then I'll go up under Edit and just choose Duplicate to create a duplicate of that layer. And then I can right-click on the duplicate and choose Environment Layer. And what this will do, if you see the icon right here, it looks kind of like a circle. It's actually wrapping a sphere around absolutely everything. So here, if I make this a little larger, you can see it's definitely encompassing the entire thing, and it's giving it a much more interesting look. If I press T to open its opacity, I can bring down the opacity of the environment layer, and it does kind of blend it back a little bit. Just understand, whenever you make some adjustments, you're going to have to give your system a little bit longer to go ahead and redraw the scene to give you a good preview as to what's going on. So really, when I'm working with 3D objects in the Ray Trace renderer, what I'll do is go ahead and extrude the base object, and I'll create my animation. Then once I've created my animation, I'll go ahead and work with the material options and create an environment layer so that I can really see what's going on here. But the last thing you need to do before you ever try and render out of the Ray Trace renderer is actually change its render options. Because if I rendered this right now, it would look kind of jagged and ragged like this, and I don't like that. So let's go back down here to this button where our previews are, click and hold, and notice at the bottom there are renderer options. So if I click on that, in here, I can increase the ray tracing quality. So I'll go ahead and change that up to 9. And then under the anti-aliasing filter, I'll click on the pull down, and each one of these is slightly different. I'll go ahead and choose cubic because I think that looks pretty darn good. Now, understand when you change the ray tracing quality, here, it's going to give you an example of how many motion blur samples it's going to use per frame. and it'll give you some general guidelines as to how long things are going to take. But just understand it'll take a little while the higher this number is. So when I click OK, I'm going to have to wait here a little while for my system to go ahead and redraw. But once it actually redraws, you'll get to see that the quality of the ray trace renderer can definitely get bumped up considerably as long as you make sure to go down to your renderer options. So once you've actually bumped up your renderer options, then you can go ahead and add this into your render queue and knock out a render of your 3D animation. Just make sure that you give yourself enough time so that your system can go ahead and process through each of the different layers it needs to go through to actually render a nice, clean, ray traced 3D object.